Welcome to the ASPR podcast Inside Conflict with Moritz Ehrmann. So in the coming episodes, we will be discussing about the situation in Iraq, where of course only a few years ago, all the world's eyes were turned on this country when it was liberated from the so-called Islamic State. Today, the situation in Iraq remains critical, not only for its 40 million people, but also for the regional international peace and security. Iraq held parliamentary elections last October that saw a major reshuffling of political forces, most notably also the entrance of independents and former protesters into parliament. And in consequence, we could see a major paradigm shift in how Iraq is governed, with major implications for the security and stability of the country, and in extension, the wider region. So a lot of interesting material for discussion. And I'm very happy to have with us two very well-known experts on Iraqi affairs. So this is Mr. Zaitoun Al-Kenani, an Iraq-focused Middle East analyst, PhD researcher and teaching assistant at Aberdeen University, and also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Iranian Studies in Ankara. Also here with us is Mrs. Inna Rudolph, who is an expert on Iraq, and more specifically also on its popular mobilization forces. She is a PhD candidate at King's College in London, and very importantly for us, of course, also a consultant for the ASPR. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for hosting us.
So in this second discussion on the internal situation of Iraqi politics, we are mostly going to focus on the future of the political process, but also of so many other dynamics and challenges that the new government, whatever shape it might take, will definitely face. Let us to also have a direct link sort of to the discussion we had in our last episode about the very complicated dynamics of Iraqi politics and of government formation. Also look at the very specific issue that is definitely an ongoing and also future concern of the central government in Baghdad, which is the relations to the Kurdish region. Of course, knowing that the Kurdish region has their own very specific dynamic, complicated dynamic of governance between the two major traditional parties there. And of course, the last developments around the Iraqi election, especially the presidential election, to remind everyone, of course, that in the government system in Iraq, the Iraqi president is always a Kurd. And sort of what did this do to the already very complicated dynamics in the political spectrum in the Kurdish region? Zaitoun, what is your opinion on that?
So there are two things we're witnessing with the Kurdish or the recent Kurdish engagement within Iraqi politics. And they're also going through, when we're saying they, we mean Kurdish politics in contrast to the politics of the rest of Iraq, or as many people like to call it, the Arab Iraq, so beyond the Kurdistan region. We are witnessing two different types of new transitions and transformations that the traditional political parties are facing. One of them is taking place in Baghdad, and one of them is taking place in Erbil. the one that is taking place in Erbil, is that the Kurdistan Democratic Party is realizing that it can overtake the positions that are dominated by the PUK, which is shortcut for Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, and go against the customary agreement that the two parties have been sharing and enjoying since post-2003 Iraq. One of the common things that this agreement is based on is that PUK controls the southern region of Iraqi Kurdistan, and KDP controls the northern part of northern Iraqi Kurdistan. KDP and more specifically the Barzani family are the ones to be heading the government of the Kurdistan Regional Government, that is KRG, and PUK would be the ones nominating the Kurdish candidate for the Iraqi president, which is the main Kurdish share of the ethnic sectarian quota of post-2003 Iraq. Now, due to many obstacles that PUK have been facing for the past few years, KDP have realized that this is a great opportunity to challenge that customary agreement and become unilateral in its representation of the Kurdish community in Iraq. One of the reasons that a lot of observers believe led to the gradual decline of influence and power by PUK within Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq in general is the sudden death of Jalal Talabani, one of the co-founders of PUK and known for being the political godfather of PUK. He was also the president for Iraq for 2 consecutive terms, representing the Kurdish share in the Iraqi federal government. And following his death, of course, we realized that an intra-Talabani is the household or the tribe or the family dominating PUK. Those intra-Talabani rivalries between Bafil Talabani and Lahore Talabani also led to a major decline of power. We witnessed those differences in the PUK leadership being very evident when we witnessed very different statements and stances and positions towards the independence referendum that was organized by KDP back in 2017. And then, of course, the media war that KDP campaigned against PUK and portraying them as giving up Kirkuk, the disputed province, to the Iraqi federal forces, and of course the PMF, Al-Hashd al-Shabi, which at the time was a part of the liberation of the Iraqi provinces from ISIS, alongside the international coalition and the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, along with the Iraqi forces, of course. So we are realizing that KDP is taking an advantage of the fall of PUK and the fall of PUK's influence in Iraqi Kurdistan. Most evidently, that was evident electorally. KDP got the highest Kurdish votes. PUK faced a major defeat electorally, a very similar defeat that the Shia coordination parties faced in contrast to the last elections. And they're trying to do so as well by aligning themselves with the new trendy political transition from identity to issue politics by creating a trans-ethno-sectarian alliance with the Sadrist movement and, of course, the Sunni blocs. And regardless of how the presidential nomination will take place, the Kurdish rivalry between PUK and KDP over the Iraqi presidency following the early elections of 2021 is the most intensified since post-2003 Iraq. And we can confidently say that this is the most major challenge faced by the Kurdish customary agreement that did balance the power sharing agreement that they enjoyed since the US invasion.
So indeed, very significant. Okay, yeah, that seems to be one of the things that sort of the future Iraqi political system will have to continue to deal with. An entirely different question that certainly a future Iraqi government will have to deal with is the question of the future of the so-called popular mobilization forces, or the Hashd al-Shabi. Many challenges related to this question, of course. Inna, what's your take on this? How do you see this developing in the coming months and years? What are the challenges? What needs to be done? And probably most importantly, what can be done?
I think the Hashd al-Shabi is likely to remain a critical bargaining chip in any future negotiations, both between the Sadrist and the framework, but also like for any future candidates for the post of Minister of Interior and Minister of Defense, and also like any actors with the say on the Iraqi security portfolio. So for that, it's important also to clarify what are the popular mobilization forces. They constitute a state-sanctioned paramilitary umbrella comprising different formations, which often are in internal competition with each other, not just for resources, but also like for the general orientation of this relatively young agency. So I think for the future, it's important to trace what is the current discourse about reforming or restructuring the agency. There have been several ideas circulating how to create an identity within the organization, within the Hashd, that moves away from militias, from resistance factions, and from partisan projects. So one of the ideas has been, for example, to have a mixing of the different brigades, to have not just Badr brigades or Asa'ib brigades, but to have like brigades consisting of rank and file of all of those different formations, in the hope that with time passing, that those rank and file would develop a stronger identity with the Hashd al-Shabi as a national security agency and with the Iraqi security forces, of which Hashd al-Shabi formally is part of. But of course, Hashd remains a major concern for a lot of Iraq's also Gulf neighboring states, for example, with some controversial fundraising campaigns, for example, for Houthi rebels. Concerns are being raised regarding links between Fasail al-Muqawama, which means resistance factions or members of the so-called Islamic resistance, and their direct and indirect links to brigades within the Hashd al-Shabi. So there we still have the unresolved question of accountability and who can guarantee or has the responsibility to guarantee that the Hashd would never go against the agreed foreign policy line of the government. And just to point out one other major debate within the Iraqi public discourse is this argument: we as an agency, we support the state, al-Dawla, but we do not necessarily support the governments. So what I think is critically needed is a clarification. What does it mean to support the state? And that as an agency, one also has or carries a responsibility to support the work of the different agencies of the state, of which also government is an important part.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, yet another very, very complicated and important topic. Let's move on to another very important movement or actor in the Iraqi political system. We touched on it already in our last discussion 2 weeks ago. Of course, we wouldn't be talking about elections and all the changes in the system had there not been the so-called October protest movement, Tashrin protest movement in Arabic, that in effect had caused the early elections and so many other things that changed the electoral process and so on and so forth. Now we are, of course, in a situation where the elections are over, and parts of this movement have decided to join the political process and have been elected into parliament, while others have decided the opposite and sort of remained on the street, if not physically. Anyways, in protest to the system as such, and in opposition to the system, the political system as such. So what does this mean for the future? What will the people from this movement who got elected into parliament be able to gain for their cause? And what about those who remained outside of this political process and continue to protest against it? Will they keep any influence on the political process? Broad questions, I know. Zaidun, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. As you more rightfully mentioned, Tashrin is the cause of most things we're witnessing right now. It's what led to having a caretaker prime minister and early elections. And of course, it was expected that the protest movement will have different stances towards whether they should participate or boycott the elections. And the different stances are divided between, as we mentioned in the past, whether it should be a systematic change or whether they should be gradual changes. And these are, of course, discussions and debates that are very common in societies that are either moving towards democracy or that are currently experiencing a new democratic process. However, one common thing that is framed when looking at that division within Tashrin towards the early elections as being the biggest recent example is that it's reflected a major weakness in the protest movement, as they evidently presented very different strategies and stances towards their future participation. However, Tashrin is not a political force or a specific political party. Tashrin it started as a nationwide uprising, just as it has many crucial and fundamental similarities that unites the demands and unites the willingness of the Iraqi people for a better future for Iraq. It will naturally also present a lot of differences amongst those people. And that is why there is a lot of criticism and opposition towards recruiting or exploiting identity politics in post-2003 Iraq, because the core argument behind that criticism is that Shias, not every Shia in Iraq wants to be identified or represented as a Shia. There is a different Shia between a Sadrist Shia, a Shia who's more lenient to the pro-Iran factions, a secularist Shia, a liberal Shia, a right-wing liberal Shia, a leftist Shia, or even an independent Shia. And the same thing goes to the other communities in Iraq, and not just the Kurdish and Sunni, but even the Turkmen and the Christian communities in Iraq. We're getting a bit off topic here, but the Imtidad, more specifically, who did gain 9 seats in the elections, they were even praised by the boycotters. So a lot of boycotters supported them, including Al-Bayt Al-Watani, the National House Party, which is also an emerging political party out of the Tishreen protest movement, which decided to boycott the elections. Yet they called for their logistical and advisory support and their political support to Imtidad. And this is also evident amongst different activists and groups across the Tishreen protest movement. Of course, there are a lot of players and groups within the protest movement whom are more crucially against any sort of participation or recognition of the political system, because they believe another election or another democratic recognition of the system is only prolonging its survival against the will of the people. I think Imtidad has a very big responsibility ahead of its time in Parliament, even if it does not manage to push on many other parties or propose new laws to be passed in regards to reforms, and specifically in regards to prosecuting the people or the groups behind the assassinations of or the killings or the political violence committed against the peaceful protesters since October 2019. However, it has a responsibility where it needs to prove to Al-Bayt Al-Watani and other emerging parties or still very young parties from the Tishreen protest movement that bigger numbers can present a change, and an opposition, after all, in an ethno-sectarian system like Iraq can eventually lead to some change. Tishreen did prove to people that protesting and their constitutional and democratic right to civil disobedience led them to get a new government, even if they were against the having repeated phases in that system, led them to get early elections and led them to witness an electoral reform, as Ina mentioned in the past. Now the new test is, can Tishreen present an effective change, even if it's in a long-term planning strategy within the parliament? And by doing so, does it need more MPs or does it need more coalition with other parties?
Thanks a lot, Zaidun. I mean, this was again very, very comprehensive. Yet, I'm sure, Inna, you also have things to add. So, what's your angle on this dynamic? How will it continue? How will it continue again with those who are in parliament, those who aren't in parliament, the spirit of the Tishreen protest movement? What do you think about that?
I just have a short word of caution, but maybe also a cause for optimism. Zaidun was speaking about the largest test, like for all of these actors from the Tishreen movement. But I think the same also applies like for all of the actors that are not going to be part of the future government. And that is to finally form a credible opposition force within parliament. And this has been a problem for many years, that there has been an ongoing, a systemic politicization of the term opposition in Iraq, because it has been used for partisan agendas, because a certain party has always like tried to have a foot in government, but also whenever things are not going their way, to claim again the opposition card. So I think one of the major responsibilities for all of those actors outside of the government would be, again, like to reclaim the term opposition and to play a constructive role as an opposition force, and to help establish at least like a system of checks and balances to secure that accountability standards are being enhanced, and that also laws are not just being issued, but also implemented on the ground.
Thanks a lot to the two of you. This was again such a rich and interesting discussion. And the richness of this discussion probably also shows one thing, that despite all the complications in the current Iraqi political process, Iraq has made quite a way into of course, all the complications and difficulties that a democratic system brings with it. Nevertheless, comparing to some years ago, to many more years ago, it seems that there is progress, and this is something perhaps positive we can take from this discussion. Again, I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us today. In this podcast series, we are going to keep discussing about Iraq, also from a regional perspective, and some other questions relating to the futures of the country. We will do this again with a couple of experts whose names, to keep the suspense, I'm not going to share right now. But we, of course, hope to have you with us also in the next two episodes, also focusing on the situation in Iraq and around Iraq. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for hosting us.
Subscribe to our podcast or visit the website insideconflict.com. For more information about the work of the ASPR, visit aspr.ac.at. Until next time.